People often ask me about my childhood, about how I came to live with the Bennetts on their sprawling ranch in Colorado Territory. The story always starts the same way, with the day my stepfather loaded me into his wagon and drove me to the edge of nowhere, telling me I was old enough now to make my own way in the world. I was 9 years old. My name was Sarah Catherine Mills then, though I'd almost forgotten my middle name by the time Jeremiah left me standing beside that dusty crossroads with nothing but the clothes on my back and a small bundle containing my mother's Bible and a torn photograph of her holding me as a baby. The September wind cut through my thin cotton dress like it was made of paper, and I watched Jeremiah's wagon disappear over the hill without so much as a backward glance. I suppose I should explain how I came to be in such a predicament. My mother, bless her soul, had died of consumption when I was 6. My father, a good man but weak when it came to drink, had married Jeremiah's sister Constance within the year. When my father died in a mining accident 2 years later, Jeremiah became my guardian. He wasn't cruel exactly, but he made it clear that feeding and housing me was a burden he couldn't afford much longer. "You're old enough to earn your keep elsewhere," he'd said that morning as he hitched up the wagon. "There's folks heading west who need help with their young ones. You're quick with letters and numbers, and you know how to work. Someone will take you on." Standing there at that crossroads, watching the dust settle where his wagon had been, I tried to be brave. Mother had always said I had her stubborn streak, and I'd need every bit of it now. I picked up my bundle, chose the road that seemed to lead toward the setting sun, and started walking. I hadn't gone more than a mile when I heard the sound of horses approaching from behind. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped to the side of the road, remembering all the warnings about dangerous men who preyed on travelers. But when I turned to look, I saw something that surprised me. A fine carriage drawn by 2 matching bay horses, with a well-dressed gentleman holding the reins and a kind-looking woman beside him. The carriage slowed to a stop, and the woman leaned forward with concern written all over her face. She was perhaps 30 years old, with soft brown hair pinned neatly under a blue bonnet and the most gentle eyes I'd ever seen. "Child," she called out, "what on earth are you doing out here, all alone?" I lifted my chin the way Mother had taught me, trying to look more confident than I felt. "I'm traveling, ma'am. Looking for work." The gentleman, who I could see now was probably her husband, frowned deeply. He was a distinguished-looking man with silver at his temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "Where are your parents, young lady?"
"Dead, sir."
"Both of them?" I kept my voice steady, though my throat felt tight. "My guardian brought me here and said I was old enough now to make my own way." The woman gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Thomas," she said to her husband, "we cannot possibly leave a child alone on this road. The sun will be down soon, and there are wolves in these parts." Thomas Bennett, for that was his name, though I didn't know it yet, studied me with sharp but not unkind eyes. He was clearly a man of some importance, with fine clothes and well-kept hands, but there was something in his expression that reminded me of my father in his better moments. "What's your name, child?" he asked. "Sarah Catherine Mills, sir." "Well, Sarah Catherine Mills, I'm Thomas Bennett, and this is my wife, Margaret. We own a ranch about 10 miles from here. Would you like to come home with us for the night? We can discuss your situation properly over a hot meal." I hesitated, remembering all the warnings about strangers. But Mrs. Bennett's face was so full of genuine concern, and Mr. Bennett's offer sounded so much better than spending the night alone under the stars with nothing but my mother's Bible for company. "I don't have any money to pay for supper," I admitted. Mrs. Bennett's eyes softened even more. "If that were possible." "Oh, sweetheart, we wouldn't dream of charging you. Would we, Thomas?" "Certainly not." Mr. Bennett climbed down from the carriage and held out his hand to help me up. A lady should never have to pay for hospitality, especially not a young lady who's had such a difficult day. As the carriage rolled toward their ranch, Mrs. Bennett wrapped a soft shawl around my shoulders and asked gentle questions about my journey. I found myself telling her more than I'd intended, about Mother's death, about living with Jeremiah and Constance, about how they decided I was old enough to fend for myself. "That's perfectly dreadful," Mrs. Bennett murmured, her arm tightening around me. What kind of people abandon a child on a deserted road? Mr. Bennett's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. The kind who will answer for their actions if I ever encounter them, he said quietly. Then, more gently, don't you worry, Sarah Catherine. You're safe now. The Bennett ranch spread across a valley like something from a dream. There were neat pastures filled with cattle and horses, a large barn that looked freshly painted, and several smaller buildings that spoke of prosperity and careful management. But it was the main house that took my breath away, a two-story structure with a wide porch wrapped around the front and warm yellow light glowing from every window. Oh my, I breathed, forgetting to be dignified. Mrs. Bennett smiled. It's home, she said simply. And tonight it's your home too. As Mr. Bennett helped us down from the carriage, a woman emerged from the house. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and a practical dress covered by a spotless apron. Her face lit up when she saw us. Margaret, Thomas, you're later than expected. I was beginning to worry. Then her eyes fell on me, and her expression shifted to one of surprise and immediate concern. Who's this little lamb? Mary, this is Sarah Catherine Mills, Mrs. Bennett said, keeping her arm around my shoulders. She's going to be our guest tonight. Sarah Catherine, this is Mary O'Connor, our housekeeper and the finest cook in 3 counties. Mary O'Connor looked me up and down, taking in my dusty dress, my bare head, and my small bundle of possessions. But instead of judgment, her face showed only kindness. Well then, Sarah Catherine, let's get you inside and fed. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. She wasn't wrong. Living with Jeremiah and Constance had meant making do with whatever scraps were left after they'd eaten their fill. As Mary bustled around the kitchen preparing a plate of roast beef, mashed potatoes, and green beans, I tried not to stare at the abundance around me. There were fresh loaves of bread cooling on the counter, jars of preserves lining the shelves, and a pot of stew simmering on the stove that smelled like heaven. Now then, Mrs. Bennett said, settling into the chair beside me at the large kitchen table. Tell us about yourself, Sarah Catherine. What sort of schooling have you had? I can read and write, ma'am, I said between bites of the most delicious food I'd ever tasted. Mother taught me before she died, and I kept up with it after. I know my numbers too, and I can do sums in my head. Mr. Bennett, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward with interest. Can you read well enough to help with correspondence? Record keeping? I nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. I used to help my father with his accounts when he was feeling well. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett exchanged a meaningful look that I didn't understand at the time. Later, I would learn that they'd been searching for someone to help with the ranch's growing paperwork, someone who could also assist Mrs. Bennett with her various charitable projects in town. Sarah Catherine, Mrs. Bennett said gently, would you like to stay here with us? Not just for tonight, but permanently? I nearly choked on my mashed potatoes. Stay here? Really? We could use someone with your skills, Mr. Bennett said. And this house has been too quiet for too long. We never had children of our own, you see. Perhaps it's time that changed. Mary O'Connor, who had been pretending not to listen while she worked at the counter, turned around with tears in her eyes. Oh, what a blessing that would be, she said softly. This house needs the sound of young feet running up and down the stairs. I looked around at their faces. Mrs. Bennett hopeful and already protective, Mr. Bennett kind but serious, Mary beaming with joy. After years of being treated like an unwanted burden, the idea of being actually wanted felt almost too good to be true. But I don't have anything to offer in return, I said hesitantly. I can work hard, and I'm good with letters, but I don't have any money or… Sarah Catherine, Mrs. Bennett interrupted gently. Families don't base their love on what people can offer in return. Families love each other because they choose to, because they belong together. Do you understand? I nodded, though I wasn't sure I entirely believed it yet. I'd like to stay very much, if you truly want me. Then it's settled, Mr. Bennett said with satisfaction. Mary, would you prepare the blue room for Sarah Catherine? I think she'll be comfortable there. The blue room turned out to be a beautiful bedchamber on the second floor, with windows that looked out over the pastures and mountains beyond. There was a four-poster bed with a blue and white quilt, a washstand with a real mirror, and a wardrobe that Mrs. Bennett immediately began filling with dresses that had belonged to her as a girl. "I always hoped I'd have a daughter to pass these on to," she said, shaking out a pretty green dress with pearl buttons. "They'll need some alterations, but Mary's wonderful with a needle." That first night, lying in the softest bed I'd ever known, I stared up at the ceiling and tried to convince myself this wasn't all a dream. The sheets smelled like lavender, there was a thick rug under my feet, and when I'd asked for a glass of water, Mary had brought it without a single complaint about the extra work. But it was the conversation I'd overheard between Mr. and Mrs. Bennett as they stood in the hallway outside my room that finally convinced me this might be real. "She's been hurt, Thomas," Mrs. Bennett had whispered. "Did you see how she flinched when I reached for her at first? And the way she kept looking around like she expected someone to snatch her food away?" "I saw," Mr. Bennett had replied quietly. "It'll take time for her to trust that this is permanent. We'll have to be patient. She's so bright, though, and so brave, trying to manage on her own like that. I already love her, Thomas. Is that foolish? No more foolish than me wanting to hunt down that guardian of hers and give him a piece of my mind. She's ours now, Margaret. We'll make sure she knows she's safe and loved." Lying there in the darkness, I touched my mother's Bible under my pillow and whispered a prayer of gratitude. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I might actually have a future worth looking forward to. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds singing outside my window and the smell of bacon cooking downstairs. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, and then it all came flooding back. The carriage, the Bennetts, the promise of a permanent home. I dressed quickly in my old dress, not wanting to presume about the new clothes until Mrs. Bennett specifically told me to wear them. When I came downstairs, I found the family already gathered around the breakfast table, with an extra place set for me. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Bennett said warmly. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, ma'am. Better than I have in years." Mr. Bennett looked up from his newspaper with a smile. "I'm glad to hear it. Sarah Catherine, I was thinking we might ride out this morning, and I could show you the ranch. Would you like that?" I nodded eagerly. I'd always loved horses, though I'd never had much opportunity to ride. "I'd like that very much, sir." "Excellent. And please call me Thomas. We're family now." Family. The word sent a warm glow through my chest that I hadn't felt since Mother died. Maybe, just maybe, I was finally home. As we prepared for our tour of the ranch, Mrs. Bennett, who insisted I call her Margaret, presented me with a riding habit that had been hers as a young woman, altered overnight by the miracle-working Mary. "A proper ranch woman needs proper riding clothes," Margaret said with a smile. "And Sarah Catherine, there's something else. Thomas and I have been talking, and we'd like to make this official. We want to adopt you as our daughter, if you'll have us." The words hit me like a physical blow, so unexpected and wonderful that I couldn't speak for a moment. Adopted. Not just taken in out of charity, but chosen. Wanted.
Loved.
"You mean I'd really be your daughter? Not just someone you're helping?" Thomas stood up and came around the table to kneel beside my chair, his face serious but kind. "Sarah Catherine, Margaret, and I never had children of our own, but we always wanted a family. Yesterday, when we saw you on that road, it felt like providence. Like God had finally answered our prayers in a way we never expected. You'd be Sarah Catherine Bennett," Margaret added softly. "Our daughter in every way that matters, legally, emotionally, completely." I looked between their faces, seeing nothing but love and hope and genuine desire to make me part of their lives. The scared, abandoned little girl who'd been left at that crossroads felt like someone from a story, not my real life. "Yes," I whispered, and then louder. "Yes, please. I want to be your daughter more than anything in the world." The adoption papers were filed the very next week, with Judge Morrison presiding over the ceremony in his chambers in town. I wore the green dress with pearl buttons, and Margaret had braided ribbons in my hair. When Judge Morrison pronounced me Sarah Catherine Bennett, officially and legally the daughter of Thomas and Margaret Bennett, I felt something broken inside me finally heal. But the real changes were just beginning. Thomas, true to his word, taught me everything about running a ranch, how to read the account books, how to correspond with buyers in Denver and San Francisco, how to manage the seasonal rhythms of cattle ranching. Margaret introduced me to the social graces expected of a rancher's daughter, but also to her charity work helping other displaced children and struggling families in our community. Comfort shared is comfort doubled, she would say, as we prepared baskets for families facing hard times. We've been blessed, Sarah Catherine. It's our responsibility to share those blessings. Most importantly, they both showed me what a real family looked like, not perfect, but built on respect and genuine care for each other's happiness. When I had nightmares about being abandoned again, one of them would sit with me until I fell back asleep. When I struggled with a particularly difficult lesson, Thomas would patiently explain it again. When I succeeded at something, Margaret would beam with pride as if I'd performed a miracle. Mary O'Connor, meanwhile, became the grandmother I'd never known, teaching me to cook and keep house with the skills a ranch woman would need, but also singing Irish ballads while we worked and telling stories about her own journey from the old country. The seasons passed, each one bringing new lessons and deeper bonds. By my 10th birthday, celebrated with a party that included half the families in the county, I could barely remember the scared child who'd been left at that crossroads. I was Sarah Catherine Bennett now, daughter of the most respected rancher in 3 counties, surrounded by love and security I'd never imagined possible. But perhaps the most important change was the gradual understanding that this was truly permanent. That no matter what happened, Thomas and Margaret would never give up on me the way Jeremiah had. They'd chosen me not because they had to, but because they wanted to, and that made all the difference in the world. I remember the day this truth really sank in. It was 3 months after my adoption, during a particularly harsh November storm that had kept us all indoors for days. I'd been helping Margaret with her correspondence when I accidentally knocked over her inkwell, spilling black ink across several important letters she'd been working on for hours. My heart nearly stopped. With Jeremiah and Constance, such a mistake would have earned me a slap and banishment to my room without supper. I braced myself for the anger, the disappointment, the reminder that I was nothing but trouble. Instead, Margaret looked at the ruined papers, looked at my terrified face, and began to laugh. "Oh, Sarah Catherine," she said, pulling me into her arms as I started to cry. "It's only ink and paper. They can be replaced. You cannot." That afternoon, she taught me how to mix ink from scratch, how to cut new pen nibs, and how to improve my already neat handwriting by copying out her favorite poems. What could have been a disaster became an afternoon of learning and bonding. It was then I began to truly believe that this family would love me even when I made mistakes. The winter months deepened my understanding of what it meant to belong somewhere. The ranch operated on a different rhythm during the cold season, fewer outside chores, more time for indoor activities, longer evenings by the fire. Thomas would read aloud from adventure novels while Margaret worked on her needlepoint and I practiced my letters or worked on the arithmetic problems he'd set for me. "Education is the greatest gift we can give you," Thomas would say when I complained about particularly difficult sums. "Land can be lost, money can disappear, but knowledge stays with you forever." He was preparing me for a future I'd never dared imagine, one where I might need to manage business affairs, correspond with important people, even potentially run the ranch myself someday. The idea both thrilled and terrified me. "But I'm just a girl," I protested one evening when he was explaining the complexities of cattle futures and market pricing. "Surely you'll want to leave the ranch to a son, if you ever have one." Thomas set down his papers and looked at me seriously. "Sarah Catherine, you are our daughter. Not just anything. And intelligence and character matter far more than whether you wear dresses or trousers. Some of the shrewdest business people I know are women." Margaret looked up from her sewing with a smile. "Besides, dear, we're too old now to expect more children. You're at our one chance to raise someone who'll carry on what we've built here." The weight of that responsibility should have been overwhelming, but instead it filled me with purpose. They weren't just giving me a home, they were giving me a legacy to protect and nurture. As winter gave way to spring, I began to understand the seasonal rhythms of ranch life. There was the excitement of new calves being born, the careful planning of which pastures to use for grazing, the negotiations with buyers from back east. Thomas included me in all of it, explaining his decisions and asking for my thoughts as if my 10-year-old opinions actually mattered. "Why do you think we should sell to the Denver buyers instead of the Kansas City ones?" he'd ask, showing me the competing offers. I'd study the papers carefully, trying to apply the lessons he'd taught me about transportation costs, market timing, and buyer reliability. Sometimes I was wrong, but he never made me feel foolish. Instead, he'd walk me through his reasoning, helping me understand the factors I'd missed. "A fine analysis," he'd say. "You're thinking like a true rancher now." The spring also brought my first real test of whether I truly belonged in this new world. Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife from town, came calling one afternoon with her daughter Priscilla, who was exactly my age. Priscilla had been born into wealth and position, with fine clothes and expensive dolls, and she made sure I knew it. "So you're the foundling the Bennetts took in," she said while our mothers visited in the parlor. Her tone made foundling sound like something distasteful. "Mama says your real parents were probably criminals or worse." The old Sarah Catherine would have shrunk away, accepting the judgment. But I was a Bennett now, with all the confidence that name carried. "My real parents are Thomas and Margaret Bennett," I replied calmly. "They chose me because they wanted me, not because they had to have me. Can you say the same?" Priscilla's face turned red, and she spent the rest of the visit sulking. Later, when I told Margaret about the exchange, I worried I'd been too bold. "You defended yourself with dignity," Margaret said approvingly. "That's exactly what a Bennett should do. We don't start fights, but we don't back down from bullies either." That approval meant the world to me. I was learning to stand up for myself, to claim my place in this family and community with confidence. The real confirmation of my belonging came that summer, during the annual Founders' Day celebration in town. It was the biggest social event of the year, with families from all over the county gathering for speeches, contests, and a community dance. I'd been nervous about attending. It would be my first major public appearance as Sarah Catherine Bennett, and I knew people would be watching and whispering. Margaret had sewn me a beautiful new dress for the occasion, pale yellow with tiny blue flowers embroidered around the collar. Mary had braided ribbons in my hair, and Thomas had presented me with a delicate gold locket that had belonged to his mother. "Every Bennett woman has worn this," he said as he fastened it around my neck. "Now it's yours." At the celebration, I watched nervously as Thomas was called upon to give one of the main speeches. He was, after all, one of the most prominent citizens. But instead of talking about cattle prices or territorial politics, he spoke about family and community. "This past year has brought great joy to our household," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "Margaret and I have been blessed with a daughter, Sarah Catherine Bennett. She's brought laughter back into our home and reminded us that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, commitment, and love." The applause that followed was warm and genuine. People who had known Thomas and Margaret for years smiled and nodded their approval. Mrs. Pemberton looked sour, but she was outnumbered by neighbors who had watched the transformation in the Bennett household with delight. After the speech, person after person came up to congratulate Thomas and Margaret and to welcome me officially into the community. Mrs. Harris, who ran the general store, told me I'd grown into a fine young lady. Mr. Fletcher, who managed the bank, said he looked forward to doing business with me when I was older. Even the stern Methodist minister, Brother Williams, told me I was a credit to my family name. But the moment that meant the most came during the community dance. Thomas had taught me the basic steps at home, and I'd been looking forward to dancing with him. But as the first waltz began, he bowed formally and offered his arm. "Miss Bennett," he said with a smile, "would you do me the honor?" Miss Bennett. Not Sarah Catherine, not dear, but Miss Bennett, acknowledging me as a proper young lady of the family. As we swirled around the dance floor, I felt the eyes of the whole community on us, not with judgment, but with approval. This was Thomas Bennett dancing with his daughter, introducing her to society as a member of one of the county's most respected families. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked later as we rode home in the carriage, the stars bright overhead and the sound of the celebration still echoing behind us. "Like I finally know where I belong," I answered honestly. "Like I'm really, truly home." Thomas reached over and squeezed my hand. "That's because you are, daughter. You always will be." That night, as I prepared for bed in my beautiful room with its blue quilt and lace curtains, I thought about the scared little girl who'd been abandoned at the crossroads almost a year ago. She felt like someone from another lifetime, someone I'd read about in a book, perhaps, but not actually me. I was Sarah Catherine Bennett now, daughter of Thomas and Margaret, future heir to one of the finest ranches in Colorado Territory. I had a family who loved me unconditionally, a community that accepted me, and a future bright with possibility. But even as I drifted off to sleep, content and secure, I didn't know that my peaceful new life was about to face its greatest test. Because sometimes the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you think you've run from it. And sometimes the people who've wronged you decide they want back what they threw away. But that's a story for another day. The story of how the Bennetts and I discovered just how far we'd go to protect our family and how strong our bonds really were when they were truly tested. The test of our family bonds came on a scorching July afternoon 2 years after my adoption, when I was 12 years old and had grown confident in my place as a Bennett. I was in the garden with Mary, picking vegetables for supper, when we heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Nothing unusual in that. We often had visitors at the ranch, neighbors stopping by for business or social calls. But when I looked up and saw the occupants of that wagon, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Jeremiah sat on the driver's seat, looking older and meaner than I remembered, his face weathered by 2 years of hard living. Beside him sat a woman I didn't recognize, thin and sharp-faced, with calculating eyes that reminded me of a hawk sizing up its prey. But it was the third passenger that made my heart pound with terror. Constance, my former stepmother, climbed down from the wagon with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She wore a dress that had seen better days and a bonnet that couldn't quite hide the hardness that had settled into her features. "Well, well," she said, her voice carrying that false sweetness I remembered so well. "If it isn't little Sarah Catherine, all grown up and playing at being a lady." Mary stepped protectively in front of me, her Irish temper already rising. "And who might you be, coming onto this property uninvited and speaking to the child with such disrespect?" "I'm her stepmother," Constance replied, straightening her shoulders as if that title still meant something. "Constance Mills, and I've come to collect what's mine." "You're nothing to this child," Mary said firmly. "She's Sarah Catherine Bennett now, legally adopted and properly raised. You've no claim here." But Jeremiah had climbed down from the wagon too, and he was holding a rolled paper in his grimy hands. "That's where you're wrong, old woman. We've got legal documents that say different." The sharp-faced woman, who I would later learn was named Abigail Crouch, spoke for the first time. Her voice was as cold as winter wind. "I'm Mrs. Crouch, representative of the Children's Welfare Association of Kansas Territory. We've received reports of irregularities in this adoption, and we're here to investigate the child's living situation." Mary's face went pale, but her voice stayed steady. There were no irregularities. Judge Morrison himself performed the ceremony, and it was all done proper and legal. Judge Morrison exceeded his authority, Mrs. Crouch said smoothly. The adoption was conducted without proper investigation into the child's background or verification of the guardianship transfer. We're here to correct that oversight. I found my voice at last, though it came out smaller than I would have liked. I don't want to go anywhere. This is my home. Thomas and Margaret are my parents now. Constance's laugh was bitter. "Oh, you've gotten above yourself, haven't you? Playing at being a rancher's daughter when you're nothing but a mill worker's brat. But that's all done with now. You're coming with us." "Where are Mr. and Mrs. Bennett?" Mrs. Crouch asked, looking around the property with disapproving eyes. Surely they wouldn't leave a young girl unsupervised with only a servant for protection. "They've gone to Denver on business," Mary said reluctantly. "They'll be back tomorrow evening." I saw the satisfied look that passed between Jeremiah and Mrs. Crouch. They'd planned this, timed their arrival for when Thomas and Margaret would be away. My heart sank as I realized how carefully they'd orchestrated this confrontation. Then there's no one here with legal authority to prevent us from fulfilling our duty, Mrs. Crouch said with obvious satisfaction. Sarah Mills, gather your belongings. You're coming with us immediately. Sarah Bennett, I corrected, finding some courage in the name. And I won't go. You can't make me. Jeremiah's face darkened. You'll do as you're told, girl, just like you did before. You think these fancy folks really care about you? They just wanted free labor, someone to do their books and correspondence without paying wages. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, not because I believed it, but because it echoed the deepest fears I'd harbored in those early days. What if they were right? What if I'd been fooling myself about Thomas and Margaret's love? But then I thought about Margaret teaching me to embroider, taking time from her busy day just because I'd expressed interest. I remembered Thomas patiently explaining ranch management to me, not because he needed my help but because he wanted me to understand the legacy I'd inherit. I thought about their faces when they danced with me at the Founders' Day celebration, glowing with genuine pride and affection. You're wrong, I said, my voice growing stronger. They love me. They chose me to be their daughter, not their servant. Love. Constance scoffed. What do you know about love? You're just a convenient charity case, a way for them to feel good about themselves. But we're your real family, and we've come to take you home. This is my home, I repeated firmly. And you're not my family. You abandoned me at a crossroads and left me to die. We left you where you could find help, Jeremiah said defensively. Knew someone would come along and take pity on you. Worked out well enough, didn't it? Mrs. Crouch stepped forward with her papers. Regardless of past circumstances, the current situation is irregular. A single gentleman and his wife, no matter how well-intentioned, cannot provide the proper supervision and moral guidance a young girl requires. The association has identified a suitable placement for you with a family in Kansas who specialize in taking in wayward children. Wayward? Mary's voice rose indignantly. This child is as proper and well-behaved as any young lady in the territory. There's nothing wayward about her. Living alone with a man who's not her blood relative, allowed to participate in ranch business like a boy, given freedoms no decent girl should have, I'd call that quite wayward indeed, Mrs. Crouch replied coldly. I felt my cheeks burn with anger and embarrassment. Everything that made my life with the Bennetts wonderful, my education, my involvement in ranch decisions, my freedom to ride and explore, was being twisted into something shameful. Thomas and Margaret have given me the best life anyone could ask for, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. I'm educated, I'm healthy, I'm loved. What more could you possibly want from me? Proper feminine training, Mrs. Crouch replied primly. Domestic skills, religious instruction, preparation for a suitable marriage. Not this masculine education you've received. Mary laughed harshly. Masculine education? The child can read and write better than most adults, keeps accounts that would put bank clerks to shame, and runs this household with more skill than women twice her age. How is any of that masculine? But Mrs. Crouch had made up her mind, and I could see that no amount of argument would sway her. She'd been paid to retrieve me, and retrieve me she would. Sarah Mills, she said again, you have 10 minutes to gather your personal belongings. We have a long journey ahead of us. I won't go, I repeated, but my voice shook now. You can't make me leave. Actually, we can, Jeremiah said with an ugly smile. Mrs. Crouch here has the authority to remove children from unsuitable situations. And this situation is definitely unsuitable. Mary grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. Run to the barn, she whispered urgently. Find Pete and the others. They won't let these people take you. But Mrs. Crouch had heard. Any interference from the ranch hands will be reported to the territorial authorities as obstruction of official business. They could face serious legal consequences. I felt the trap closing around me. These people had planned everything so carefully, arriving when Thomas and Margaret were away, bringing official-looking documents, threatening legal action against anyone who tried to help me. They knew exactly how to manipulate the system to get what they wanted. What do you really want? I asked desperately. Is it money? Thomas will pay you to leave me alone." Constance's eyes lit up with greed, but Mrs. Crouch cut her off before she could speak. "This isn't about money, child. It's about your moral welfare. The family we've selected for you in Kansas will provide the proper guidance you need." The proper guidance. I'd heard those words before from other officials who made their living by moving children around like livestock. I'd seen what happened to the children who disappeared into such proper homes. They worked from dawn to dusk, received minimal food and education, and were treated little better than indentured servants. "Please," I said, hating the pleading note in my voice but unable to stop it.
Please don't do this.
"I'm happy here. I'm safe and loved and getting a good education. Isn't that what you want for me?" Mrs. Crouch's expression softened slightly, and for a moment I thought I might have reached her. But then she shook her head firmly. "What you think you want and what's truly best for you are two different things, Sarah. You've been allowed to run wild here, given ideas above your station. The Hendersons in Kansas will help you understand your proper place in the world." The Hendersons. The name hit me like a club. I'd heard whispers about families like that, people who took in displaced children under the guise of Christian charity, but who really wanted unpaid laborers. The children who went to such places were rarely heard from again. "Mary," I whispered, "please don't let them take me." But Mary, for all her fierce loyalty and protective instincts, was just a housekeeper. She had no legal authority to stop them, and she knew it. I could see the helpless rage in her eyes as she realized there was nothing she could do. "The child stays here," a new voice said from behind us. We all turned to see Pete Gonzalez, the ranch foreman, approaching with 3 of the other hands. Pete was a quiet man normally, but there was steel in his voice now that made even Mrs. Crouch take a step back. "This is official business," Mrs. Crouch said, but her voice wasn't quite as steady as before. "You have no authority to interfere." "Maybe not," Pete said calmly. "But Mr. Bennett left me in charge of this ranch and everyone on it while he's away. That includes Miss Sarah. And I'm not letting anyone take her anywhere without his permission." Jeremiah puffed up his chest. "You're just hired help. You got no say in this." Pete's hand moved casually to rest on the handle of the long knife he wore at his belt, not threatening exactly, but making it clear he was prepared for trouble. "I got say over what happens on this property and what happens to the people under my protection. And Miss Sarah is definitely under my protection." For a tense moment, I thought there might be real trouble. But Mrs. Crouch was too smart to let things escalate into actual conflict. That would bring territorial authorities down on her own head, and she couldn't afford that kind of scrutiny. "Very well," she said stiffly. "We'll return tomorrow with proper legal enforcement. But mark my words, that child will be coming with us, one way or another." As they climbed back into their wagon, Constance shot me a look full of malice. "You always were too proud for your own good, Sarah. But pride comes before a fall, and your fall is coming." After they'd driven away, I stood shaking in the garden while Mary fussed over me and Pete organized the hands to keep watch. But I knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Mrs. Crouch had been right about one thing. She did have official authority, and when she returned with legal enforcement, there would be nothing Pete or anyone else could do to stop her. "We need to get word to Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," Mary said urgently. "They need to come home immediately." "Already sent Billy to town," Pete replied. "He'll telegraph them in Denver, let them know what's happening. But even if they start back right away, it'll take them most of 2 days to get here." 2 days. Would that be enough time for Mrs. Crouch to return with reinforcements? Or would Thomas and Margaret arrive to find me already gone, spirited away to Kansas and a life of servitude? That night, I couldn't sleep despite Mary's reassurances and Pete's promise to keep watch. I kept thinking about everything I'd found with the Bennetts, the love, the security, the sense of belonging, the bright future stretching ahead of me. Was I about to lose it all because of some technicality in legal paperwork? But more than that, I thought about what Mrs. Crouch had said about my education being inappropriate, my freedoms being wrong for a girl. Was she right? Had Thomas and Margaret been wrong to treat me like a son as well as a daughter, to prepare me to inherit and manage the ranch? By morning, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. If Mrs. Crouch wanted to see a properly feminine, compliant young lady, then that's exactly what I'd show her. But I'd do it on my own terms, in a way that protected my family and secured my future. When the wagon returned late that afternoon, this time accompanied by 2 territorial marshals with official-looking badges, I was ready for them. I met them on the front porch wearing my finest dress, my hair perfectly arranged, my posture everything a finishing school could have taught me. Mary stood beside me, and Pete flanked us with several of the hands, all trying to look respectful rather than threatening. "Mrs. Crouch," I said in my most polite voice, "I understand you're concerned about my welfare and education. Perhaps we could discuss this matter properly, like civilized people?" Mrs. Crouch looked surprised by my change in demeanor, but she nodded cautiously. "Certainly, Sarah. I'm glad to see you're being more reasonable." "Oh, I've had time to think about what you said yesterday," I replied sweetly. "About proper feminine education and moral guidance. And you're absolutely right that those things are important for a young lady." I saw confusion flicker across Jeremiah's face. This wasn't the defiant child he'd expected to collect. But Mrs. Crouch was nodding approvingly. "I'm pleased to hear you've come to understand the gravity of your situation," she said. "The Hendersons are good Christian people who will help you develop into a proper young woman." "I'm sure they are," I agreed. "But I wonder if you've had a chance to fully investigate the Bennett's qualifications as guardians? Because if you had, you might have discovered some relevant information." Mrs. Crouch frowned. "What sort of information?" I smiled my most innocent smile. "Well, for instance, did you know that Margaret Bennett was educated at the Boston Female Seminary, one of the most prestigious finishing schools in the country? She's been providing me with exactly the kind of feminine education you're concerned about." That was true, though I'd been more interested in Thomas's business lessons than Margaret's deportment instruction. But Mrs. Crouch didn't need to know that. "And Thomas Bennett," I continued, "graduated from Harvard University and served in the territorial legislature before establishing the ranch. He's considered one of the most respectable gentlemen in Colorado Territory. Surely you can't question his moral character?" Also true, and clearly news to Mrs. Crouch, who was beginning to look less certain of herself. "Furthermore," I said, warming to my theme, "I think you should know that the Bennetts have been planning to send me to finishing school in Denver next year to complete my education in all the feminine graces. They're quite committed to raising me as a proper lady." This was a complete fabrication, but it sounded plausible, and I could see it having an effect on both Mrs. Crouch and the marshals. "If that's true," one of the marshals said slowly, "then it changes the situation considerably. We were told the child was receiving an inappropriate masculine education." "Oh, quite the contrary," I said earnestly. "I've been learning embroidery, music, proper correspondence, household management, all the skills a lady needs. Plus, of course, my academic studies, because Thomas says an intelligent wife is a blessing to any household." Mrs. Crouch was looking distinctly uncomfortable now. Her entire case was built on the premise that my education was inappropriate, but I was systematically dismantling that argument. "Be that as it may," she said stiffly, "there are still questions about the legitimacy of the adoption itself." "Oh, I'm sure those can be cleared up easily," I replied with confidence I didn't feel. "Thomas keeps copies of all the legal documents in his study. Would you like to see them? I'm quite sure you'll find everything in perfect order." The truth was, I had no idea what documents Thomas kept or whether they would satisfy Mrs. Crouch's requirements. But I was betting that her knowledge of territorial adoption law was as shaky as her investigation of the Bennetts had been. "That won't be necessary," she said quickly, too quickly, confirming my suspicion that she was operating more on authority than actual legal knowledge. "Wonderful," I said brightly. "Then I assume there's no problem with my remaining here until Thomas and Margaret return from Denver? They should be back this evening, and I'm sure they'll be delighted to discuss my future education with you." Mrs. Crouch looked trapped. She'd come expecting to collect a defiant, improperly raised child from unsuitable guardians. Instead, she'd found what appeared to be a well-educated young lady being raised by eminently respectable people. Her entire justification for intervention was crumbling. But Jeremiah wasn't ready to give up. "Don't listen to her fancy talk," he said desperately. She's putting on airs, trying to fool you. I know this girl. She's willful and disobedient and needs a firm hand. Actually, I said, turning to face him directly, I think these gentlemen would be interested to know exactly why you abandoned me at that crossroads 2 years ago, Jeremiah. And what your real interest is in retrieving me now. His face went pale. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do, I said sweetly. After all, if you were truly concerned about my welfare, why did you wait 2 years to come looking for me? Why didn't you check to make sure I was safe after you left me on that road? One of the marshals was looking at Jeremiah with growing suspicion. That's a good question. What's your interest in this child, mister? Jeremiah stammered something about family duty, but it was clear he was lying. And suddenly I understood what this was really about. He's being paid, I said with sudden clarity. Someone is paying him to bring me to Kansas, aren't they? This isn't about my welfare at all, it's about money. Mrs. Crouch's face flushed red, but she didn't deny it. The marshal stepped closer to Jeremiah, his hand resting on his badge. Is that true, mister? Are you being compensated for delivering this child? She's family, Jeremiah said weakly. I got it right. Actually, you don't, I interrupted. You gave up any rights you might have had when you abandoned me. Thomas and Margaret Bennett are my legal guardians now, and I'm quite happy with that arrangement. The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at a fast gallop. My heart leaped as I recognized Thomas's stallion, with Margaret riding beside him on her mare. They'd received Pete's telegram and ridden hard to get home. Thomas dismounted while his horse was still moving, his face thunderous as he took in the scene on his front porch. Margaret was right behind him, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by protective fury. What, Thomas said in a voice like winter ice, is the meaning of this invasion of my property? Mrs. Crouch straightened her shoulders, but I could see her confidence wavering in the face of Thomas's obvious authority and righteous anger. Mr. Bennett, I presume? I'm Mrs. Crouch, representing the Children's Welfare Association. We're investigating irregularities in your adoption of this child. Irregularities. Thomas's voice could have frozen fire. What irregularities? The adoption was conducted by a territorial judge according to all proper procedures. The child was removed from her guardian without proper legal process, Mrs. Crouch said, but she sounded less certain than she had earlier. The child was abandoned. Margaret spoke for the first time, her voice shaking with controlled fury. Left alone on a road to die. We saved her life and gave her a proper home. Nevertheless, Mrs. Crouch persisted, questions remain about the suitability of this environment for a young girl. Thomas looked around at the clean, prosperous ranch, the well-dressed and respectful employees, the obvious signs of careful management and moral oversight. Then he looked at Mrs. Crouch's threadbare dress and calculating eyes. I see, he said quietly. And I suppose you have a better situation in mind? One that, perhaps, includes some form of compensation for your services? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Crouch's face went white, then red, then white again. How dare you imply? I'm not implying anything, Thomas cut her off. I'm stating clearly that this appears to be an attempt to extort money or steal a child for profit. And I'm wondering what the territorial authorities will make of that when I file my report. One of the marshals cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Bennett, if you have documentation of the legal adoption? I do indeed, Thomas replied grimly. Signed by Judge Morrison, witnessed by 3 upstanding citizens, and filed properly with the territorial clerk. Would you like to see it? That would be helpful, the marshal said. While Thomas went to retrieve the papers, Margaret came to stand beside me, her arm around my shoulders in a gesture both protective and possessive. Sarah Catherine, she said softly, are you all right? They didn't hurt you or frighten you too badly? I'm fine, I assured her. Pete and Mary took good care of me. Margaret's eyes filled with tears of relief and rage. When we got Pete's telegram, I was so afraid we'd be too late. The thought of losing you. You'll never lose me, I promised her. This is my home, and you're my family. No one can change that. When Thomas returned with the adoption papers, The marshals examined them carefully, while Mrs. Crouch and Jeremiah waited with obvious growing anxiety. "These appear to be in perfect order," the first marshal said finally. "Legal adoption, properly witnessed and recorded. I don't see any irregularities." "But the circumstances of the guardianship transfer," Mrs. Crouch began desperately. "What guardianship transfer?" Thomas asked coldly. "The child was abandoned. There was no transfer because there was no guardian present to make one." "I was her guardian," Jeremiah protested. "You were her guardian when you left her alone on a road to die?" Margaret's voice was sharp as a blade. "What kind of guardian does that to a child?" Jeremiah had no answer for that, and everyone knew it. The second marshal closed his notebook with a definitive snap. "I've heard enough. The adoption appears to be completely legal and appropriate. The child is clearly well cared for and properly educated. I see no reason for any official intervention." Mrs. Crouch made one last desperate attempt. "The association has concerns about the moral environment." "The association," Thomas said with deadly quiet, "had better be very careful about making unfounded accusations against respected citizens. Slander is a serious offense in this territory." That was the end of it. Mrs. Crouch and Jeremiah climbed back into their wagon with obvious reluctance, knowing they'd failed completely in their mission. As they drove away, Mrs. Crouch called back one final threat. "This isn't over. There are other ways to ensure a child receives proper guidance." But her words rang hollow. They'd played their best hand and lost, and everyone knew it. That evening, as our family sat together on the front porch watching the sunset, I finally felt safe enough to let my guard down. The performance I'd put on for Mrs. Crouch had taken everything I had, and I was exhausted. "You were magnificent today," Thomas said proudly. "The way you handled that woman, calm, intelligent, dignified. You showed her exactly what kind of young lady you've become." "I was terrified the whole time," I admitted. "But I couldn't let them take me away from you." Margaret hugged me tighter. "You'll never have to worry about that again. We're going to make sure all our legal documents are absolutely unassailable. And we're going to make some inquiries about Mrs. Crouch and her association." "What do you think she really wanted?" I asked. Thomas's expression was grim. "Money, most likely. There are people who make their living by trafficking in displaced children, collecting fees from families who want unpaid labor, from institutions that get government funding per child, from all sorts of unsavory arrangements. It's a profitable business for those with no conscience." "But they failed," Margaret said firmly. "They failed because you're our daughter, legally and completely, and because you had the courage to stand up for yourself and your family." I thought about that as the stars came out overhead. 2 years ago, I'd been a scared, abandoned child with no one to protect me. Today, I'd faced down people who wanted to steal my future, and I'd won. I'd won because I had a family who loved me, because I'd learned to value myself as they valued me, and because I'd found the strength to fight for what mattered most. The Bennetts had given me more than a home and an education. They'd given me the confidence to claim my place in the world and defend it against anyone who tried to take it away. And that, I realized, was the most precious gift of all. The years that followed Mrs. Crouch's failed attempt to take me away were the happiest and most purposeful of my entire life. By the time I turned 15, I had grown into the young woman Thomas and Margaret had always believed I could become, confident in my abilities, secure in my place in the family, and ready to take on increasingly important responsibilities in managing the ranch. The legal victory over Mrs. Crouch had done more than just secure my future with the Bennetts. It had shown me that I possessed the intelligence and courage to protect what mattered most to me. More importantly, it had demonstrated to our entire community that I was truly a Bennett, worthy of the name and capable of upholding the family's reputation. Thomas began including me in more complex business dealings, teaching me to negotiate with cattle buyers, manage seasonal workers, and plan for the ranch's expansion. What had started as basic lessons in reading account books had evolved into a comprehensive education in business management that would have been envied by young men at the finest universities. "You have a natural head for this," Thomas told me one autumn evening as we reviewed the year's profits in his study. "Better than mine was at your age, if I'm being honest." Margaret, who was working on her embroidery nearby, looked up with a smile. Don't let it go to your head, dear. Your father's trying to flatter you into taking over the bookkeeping permanently. I laughed, but the truth was that I loved the work. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing how all the pieces of the ranch operation fit together. The careful breeding programs that produced better cattle, the strategic land purchases that improved our grazing capacity, the relationships with buyers that ensured fair prices for our beef. It was like solving an enormous puzzle, and I was getting better at it every year. But it wasn't just business skills I was developing. Margaret had insisted on what she called a well-rounded education for a lady, which meant I also studied literature, music, and the social graces expected of someone in our position. I learned to play piano well enough to entertain guests, to organize dinner parties that impressed visiting dignitaries, and to conduct correspondence with a kind of elegant prose that reflected well on the Bennett name. The combination of practical ranch management and refined social skills made me something of a curiosity in our community. I was equally comfortable discussing cattle prices with the men and embroidery patterns with the women, which sometimes puzzled people who expected young ladies to fit into more conventional categories. Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife who had always looked down on my origins, made one last attempt to put me in what she considered my proper place during a church social when I was 16. It's unusual to see a young lady so involved in business matters, she said with barely concealed disapproval. Most girls her age are focused on finding suitable husbands and preparing for domestic life. I am preparing for domestic life, I replied calmly. It's just that my domestic life will include managing one of the largest ranches in the territory. Thomas is teaching me everything I'll need to know to be a proper wife to whoever is fortunate enough to marry into the Bennett family. The subtle emphasis on marry into rather than marry me was not lost on Mrs. Pemberton or the other ladies listening. I was making it clear that any future husband would be joining my family and my established position, not the other way around. It was a bold statement for a 16-year-old girl to make, but it was also an accurate one. Thomas and Margaret had made it clear from early on that they expected me to inherit the ranch and that my eventual husband would need to be someone who could support and complement my role as the primary owner. They weren't looking for someone to take me away from them, but someone who could join our family enterprise and help it flourish. We want you to marry for love, Margaret had told me during one of our private conversations. But we also want you to marry someone who understands and respects what you'll inherit here. This ranch will be your life's work, Sarah Catherine. Your husband needs to understand that and embrace it. It was an unconventional arrangement, but then again, the Bennetts had never been particularly concerned with convention. They cared about results, about family loyalty, and about building something that would last for generations. That philosophy was put to the test when I turned 18 and several young men from prominent families began paying serious attention to me. I was, after all, not only pleasant to look at but also the heir to one of the most prosperous ranches in 3 territories. That combination made me quite an attractive prospect for ambitious young men seeking to establish themselves. The most persistent of my suitors was Jonathan Whitmore, the eldest son of a wealthy banking family from Denver. He was handsome, well-educated, and possessed of all the social graces that made him popular at the dinner parties and dances that marked the social season. On paper, he seemed like an ideal match. But there was something about Jonathan that troubled me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was at first. He was always perfectly polite, always said the right things, always behaved like a proper gentleman. Yet something in his eyes when he looked at the ranch, something in the way he talked about our future plans, made me uneasy. The truth became clear during a conversation we had while walking in Margaret's rose garden one evening in late spring. Jonathan had been visiting for several days, and I could tell he was working up the courage to make a formal proposal. Sarah Catherine, he said, taking my hand as we paused beside the fountain, I hope you know how much your friendship has come to mean to me these past months. And yours to me, I replied, though even as I said it I realized it wasn't entirely true. I enjoyed Jonathan's company well enough, but I couldn't honestly say his friendship meant a great deal to me. I've been thinking about our future, he continued, about the life we could build together. My father's bank is expanding into cattle financing, and with your family's connections in the ranching business, we could build something truly impressive. What exactly are you imagining? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. Jonathan's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Well, obviously we'd need to consolidate operations. The ranch here is too isolated for serious business development. We'd sell the land and move the primary operation closer to Denver, where we could take advantage of better transportation and banking facilities. My blood ran cold. Sell the ranch? This ranch? Our home? It's prime real estate, Sarah Catherine. Worth a fortune to the right buyer. We could use that capital to establish a much more efficient operation, something more modern and profitable. I pulled my hand free from his, staring at him in shock. Jonathan, this ranch isn't just a business investment to me. It's my home, my family's legacy. The place where Thomas and Margaret found me and raised me and taught me everything I know. He looked confused by my reaction, as if he couldn't understand why I was being emotional about something so obviously practical. But darling, you can't let sentiment interfere with good business sense. Yes, this place has sentimental value, but that's exactly why we need to be rational about it. Your parents won't live forever, and when they're gone, you'll need to make decisions based on what's best for the future, not what feels comfortable in the present. What's best for the future, I said slowly, is preserving what Thomas and Margaret have built here. This ranch isn't just successful, it's a testament to their vision, their hard work, their values. I couldn't sell it any more than I could sell my own soul. Jonathan's expression hardened slightly, revealing something calculating beneath his charming exterior. Sarah Catherine, I think you're being naive about the realities of business. A woman can't run a ranch of this size indefinitely. You'll need a husband's guidance and authority to manage the legal and financial complexities. A woman can't run a ranch? I repeated, my temper beginning to rise. I've been helping to run this ranch since I was 10 years old. I know every aspect of its operation, every detail of its finances, every challenge it faces. What exactly do you think I'm incapable of handling? It's not about capability, it's about propriety, Jonathan said, as if explaining something obvious to a child. A ranch this size requires dealing with rough men, making hard decisions, sometimes taking firm action. Those aren't appropriate responsibilities for a lady. I looked at this man who had been courting me for months, and suddenly I saw him clearly for the first time. He didn't want to marry me. He wanted to marry my inheritance. He didn't respect my abilities. He saw them as obstacles to be managed. He didn't love what I loved most in the world. He saw it as an asset to be liquidated. I think this conversation has been very enlightening, I said coolly. Thank you for clarifying your intentions, Jonathan. It saves us both considerable time and disappointment. He seemed to realize he'd overplayed his hand. Now, Sarah Catherine, don't be hasty. I'm only thinking of what's best for both of us. Surely you can see the advantages of my proposal. I can see them very clearly, I replied. The question is whether you can see why they're completely unacceptable to me. That evening, I told Thomas and Margaret about my conversation with Jonathan. I expected them to be disappointed. He was, after all, everything a parent might want in a son-in-law on the surface. Instead, Thomas nodded approvingly. I wondered when he'd show his true colors. I've been watching him these past few months, and I had my suspicions about his motives. You did? I asked, surprised. Why didn't you say anything? Because you needed to see it for yourself, Margaret said gently. We could have warned you about him, but then you might have always wondered if you'd made the right decision. This way, you know for certain what kind of man he is. And what kind of woman you are, Thomas added with pride. The kind who won't compromise her principles for security or social advantage. The kind who understands that some things are more valuable than money. Jonathan left the next morning, clearly frustrated by his failure to secure what he'd seen as an advantageous match. I felt nothing but relief as I watched his carriage disappear down the valley road. But the encounter had taught me something important about what I wanted in a future partner. I needed someone who loved the land as I did, who understood that the ranch wasn't just a business, but a way of life worth preserving. Someone who saw my abilities as assets rather than obstacles, my independence as strength rather than willfulness. I thought I might be looking for a very long time to find such a person. I was wrong. His name was Daniel Mackenzie, and he arrived at our ranch on a snowy December morning when I was 19, leading a string of horses he was hoping to sell to Thomas for our breeding program. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair and calm gray eyes, and he had the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. Unlike Jonathan's calculated charm, Daniel's appeal was completely natural and unstudied. He spoke knowledgeably about bloodlines and conformation, handled the horses with gentle expertise, and treated everyone from Thomas to the newest ranch hand with the same respectful courtesy. But it was something he said during his first dinner with us that really caught my attention. "This is beautiful country," he remarked, looking out the dining room window at the snow-covered valley. "You can see why someone would want to build a life here, put down roots, create something lasting." "Not everyone sees it that way," I said, thinking of Jonathan's eagerness to sell and relocate. "Some people see land as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold for profit." Daniel's expression grew serious. "That's a shame. Land like this, good land, well cared for land, it's not really something you own. It's something you're privileged to tend for a while, to improve if you can, to pass on in better condition than you found it." Thomas and Margaret exchanged meaningful glances, and I felt my heart skip a beat. This was a man who understood. Over the following days, as Daniel stayed to complete his business with us, I found myself drawn to his quiet intelligence and genuine appreciation for our way of life. He asked thoughtful questions about our breeding programs, our land management practices, our plans for future expansion. Unlike Jonathan's calculating interest, Daniel's curiosity seemed to spring from genuine fascination with good ranching practices. "Your daughter has quite an impressive grasp of ranch management," he told Thomas one evening. "I've never met anyone her age, male or female, with such comprehensive understanding of the business. Sarah Catherine has been my partner in this enterprise since she was old enough to hold a pencil," Thomas replied proudly. "She'll inherit all of this someday, and she'll run it better than I ever did." I watched Daniel's reaction carefully, looking for any sign of the discomfort or disapproval that such statements usually provoked in traditional men. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "She's fortunate to have had such a teacher," he said. "And you're fortunate to have such an apt pupil. Too many good operations fall apart when they pass to the next generation because the inheritors weren't properly prepared." That night, as I lay in bed thinking about our conversation, I realized I was falling in love with Daniel Mackenzie. Not with his looks, though he was certainly handsome, and not with any material advantages he might offer, because he was clearly a man of modest means. I was falling in love with his character, his values, his quiet strength and gentle wisdom. More importantly, I was falling in love with the way he saw me, not as a problem to be managed or an asset to be acquired, but as a capable woman worthy of respect and partnership. The feeling I discovered was mutual. Daniel extended his stay through the Christmas season, ostensibly to help Thomas with some winter projects, but really because none of us wanted him to leave. He fit into our family as naturally as if he'd been born to it, contributing his skills and experience while learning our particular ways of doing things. On New Year's Eve, as we sat by the fire in the parlor talking about plans and hopes for the coming year, Daniel asked if he could speak with Thomas privately. They disappeared into the study for nearly an hour, and when they emerged, both men were smiling. "Sarah Catherine," Thomas said formally, "Daniel has something he'd like to ask you." My heart hammered as Daniel knelt beside my chair, taking my hands in his work-calloused ones. "Sarah Catherine Bennett," he said, his gray eyes serious and full of love, "I know I don't have much to offer in terms of wealth or social position. I'm just a man who loves horses and good land and honest work. But I love you more than all of those things combined, and I'm hoping you might consider sharing your life with me." "What about the ranch?" I asked, needing to be sure he understood what he was asking. "This place, this life, it's not just what I do, it's who I am. I can't leave it, and I can't let anyone change it." "I wouldn't want you to," he said simply. "I'm not asking you to leave your life, Sarah Catherine. I'm asking if you'll let me join it." I looked at this man who understood that he would be marrying into my world rather than expecting me to join his, who saw my inheritance as something to be cherished rather than exploited, who loved me for exactly who I was rather than who he might be able to make me become. Yes, I said, and the words seemed to fill the room with joy. Yes, Daniel Mackenzie. I'll marry you. Our wedding took place the following spring, on a perfect May morning with the mountains standing guard over the valley and wildflowers blooming in every meadow. The entire community came to celebrate, filling our ranch with music and laughter and enough food to feed half the territory. But the moment I remember most clearly came during the ceremony, when Brother Williams asked if anyone objected to our union. For just an instant, I found myself thinking of all the people who had tried over the years to tell me what I couldn't do, who I couldn't be, what I couldn't achieve. Mrs. Crouch, who had tried to steal my future for profit. Jonathan Whitmore, who had seen my capabilities as obstacles to be overcome. Even poor misguided Mrs. Pemberton, who had never understood that some young ladies are meant for lives larger than the conventional patterns. None of them were there that day, of course. The people who surrounded Daniel and me as we exchanged vows were the ones who had supported my dreams, encouraged my growth, and celebrated my achievements. Thomas and Margaret, beaming with pride and joy. Mary O'Connor, crying happy tears as she had on the day I first arrived. Pete Gonzalez and the other ranch hands, grinning as they watched their little miss become a married lady. These were my people, and this was my place, and now I had found the partner who would help me build the future I'd always dreamed of. "You may kiss your bride," Brother Williams said, and as Daniel's lips met mine, I felt the last piece of my life fall perfectly into place. We honeymooned in our own guest room, because neither of us wanted to leave the ranch during the busy spring season. Instead of traveling to exotic locations, we spent our first weeks as a married couple working side by side, planning improvements to the property and discussing our dreams for expanding the operation. Some people might have considered it an unromantic beginning to married life, but for us it was perfect. We were building something together, combining his expertise with horses and mine with cattle and land management to create something stronger than either of us could have achieved alone. Within a year, our partnership had produced not only increased profits for the ranch, but also our first child, a daughter we named Margaret Elizabeth, after the two women who had shaped my life so profoundly. Little Maggie, as she became known, was the light of all our lives and the first of 4 children Daniel and I would raise together on the ranch. Thomas lived to see all 4 of his grandchildren born and to know that the legacy he and Margaret had built would continue for generations. He passed peacefully in his sleep when I was 28, secure in the knowledge that the ranch was in capable hands. Margaret lived another decade, long enough to help me raise our children and to see the ranch prosper under Daniel's and my management. She taught my daughters the same lessons in grace and strength she had taught me, and she spoiled my sons with the same loving indulgence she had once shown me. When she joined Thomas in the little cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley, I felt as though I had lost my mother for the second time in my life. But I also felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the gift they had given me, not just a home and a family and a future, but the knowledge that love can transform everything it touches. Now, as I write this story as an old woman surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them carrying forward the values Thomas and Margaret instilled in me so many years ago, I think about that scared little girl who was abandoned at a crossroads and left to die.